Okay, perfect. So I think, we started doing this training virtually during the pandemic. By now, we don't really probably need the virtual meeting norm slide anymore because all of us are really adept, but just sort of our meeting norms. If you want to use your camera, great. I'm super jealous, Chelsea, that you're on your couch. I should have planned that, and that would be much more comfortable. If you don't want to use your camera, that's totally fine too. If you can just mute, and I can mute you as well, just so we avoid background. The biggest key is, like, if you have questions, just ask. We're a small enough group. We can be informal. You feel free to unmute yourself and just be like, hey, I have a question. Or you can use the raise hand, and if I am not seeing your hand, then just unmute yourself. Feel free to check me, especially Morgan, Kate, Nate, if you guys see someone that has raised their hand, or if you want to use the chat to ask your question, we'll all just try to monitor that, but don't be shy about, asking questions. That's what this is all about today. And, no stupid questions, right? All of us have been here at some point or will be here, so there's really no stupid questions. So we'll go ahead and get started. Really, the plan for today, I'm going to kind of give an overview. I'm sure most of you are here because you've already decided that AICP is valuable in some way for you and your professional career. But we'll go through kind of what the test makeup is like. We'll go through a practice test. I sent out a practice test. If you don't have it, I can resend it. If you didn't get a chance to take it, that's not a big deal. We'll just pause when we put the question up, give everyone a little bit of time to think, and then kind of go through that as a group. But let's start with why are we here? Why do you want to pursue AICP? Why did all of us pursue AICP? These are sort of the main reasons, again, that APA and AICP really cite. It does give you some distinction and enhanced opportunities, which does result many times in higher salaries, which most of us are working because we want to make a living. So that's not to be underestimated. It also, I think one of the greatest things is it does help us stay informed as planners. The world of planning changes a lot. And it really, especially with our maintenance requirements, helps us stay relevant, helps ensure that we're continuing to grow as professionals. And then, of course, the letters after your name, right? You can use those letters and have that distinction. And I think people outside of the profession are more and more recognizing AICP, certainly for those of us in municipal government. I think boards and councils and city managers are starting to recognize it more. So there are those benefits as well. As many of you know, and I think Zach, you sort of mentioned this a bit, there have been some changes to AICP, and not a ton, want to spend a ton of time on this. There's been some changes to the fair exam goals, and that's really to promote more diversity and inclusion, really to think a little bit more about how the test, frankly, is better. There's also been changes to, once you get your AICP, what topic areas you are required. Previously, we only had to have law and ethics credits, but now they've added an equity credit that will be all the time. So there's those 3, law, ethics, and equity, that will always be required. And then there's going to be a targeted topic, which rotates every few years. Currently, that's sustainability and resilience. In the future, that may change. But what that means for you is that you need to pursue credits that are in these topic areas. And again, we try really hard through the chapter to offer those opportunities, either at a conference, but also through free webinars. And we work closely with other chapters to help our members achieve those mandatory credits. And then probably the most important thing for some of you on this call is the simplified process. It used to be that you had to sort of have a lot of your experience before taking the test. And there was a pilot program. They've really collapsed everything. So now, regardless of when you graduated, regardless of how much experience you have, you can sign up to take the test and schedule the exam. You can take the test, pass the exam, become an AICP candidate, and then provide your education and experience. So it's really more of a streamlined process for everyone. It's, we're calling it one path because everyone is taking the same path. For those of you who may have been in the profession previously, maybe you even had AICP previously, and unfortunately it lapsed. And we've been talking with someone who's in that boat. You can just take the test and, immediately look at getting your certification versus having to go through a different process. We also know that there are exam changes. And, you know, the first time we sort of previewed this was last spring. And for any of you that may have taken the test last spring, you took the new test. What that means is that there's new questions, and we'll go through the topic areas. They've sort of expanded the topic areas and sort of shifted things around a little bit, again, to try to remain current with where planning is going and where planning is today. But these new questions are not yet scored. And so based on our understanding, they're using the results of the May 2022 exam to sort of benchmark these questions. You know, are they good questions? Did 90% of people get it wrong, which therefore might lead them to believe it needs to be rewritten? And so from what we can tell, that's still the case. We haven't had any additional information that that's changed. So know that those questions won't count towards your final score. The challenge is that you don't know this. So don't get too concerned, especially if you're taking the test for the first time or the second or third. Don't try to figure out like what test question is new, what isn't new. Just try to focus on answering the question. You'll see in just a second how the areas of emphasis have been rebalanced, and there is a crosswalk on the website that you can look at. Frankly, I wouldn't really spend much time on that. Just, you know the content and answer the questions. There is some difference for those of you who may have taken the test prior to spring. There is a difference in formatting. So now there will be a scenario that you're presented, which is not dissimilar to previous exams, but you'll have multiple questions that are based on that same scenario. And so that's just something to be aware of. There's that new question format, and not something to be super uptight about. Just know that you'll get a scenario and you may be asked several questions on that scenario. And then again, new passing scores will be developed. It's my understanding that in the past, you used to sort of get an unofficial result immediately. You won't necessarily get that. Your results will be mailed to you after the exam. And again, that's because they're still sort of testing questions. So the exam itself, did someone have a question? We good? Johnny?
Yeah. So I saw it said June. Is that for like the May test you would expect June, or am I expecting?
Sorry.
Okay, just wanted to double check. So I can look forward to scores a little sooner than that then.
Yes, I would anticipate if you take the exam in November, you will get your results probably in late December, probably more likely in January with the holidays.
Right, after vacations, it's good.
Yeah. So, on the one hand, a little frustrating to not know right away, but on the other hand, you can just put it out of your mind and enjoy it until after the holiday.
Okay, thanks. Appreciate it.
Yeah, sorry about that typo. Thank you for catching that. So the exam itself, you'll have 3.5 hours to complete 170 questions. So for those of you that did take a shot at the practice test, it's roughly the same pace, just to give you an idea about how much time you have per question. Again, we talked about the pre-test questions. So only 150 of the questions are scored. You won't know what those are, so just answer all 170 questions to the best of your ability. They will give you a time for a tutorial to orient you to how to take the test and kind of what you need to know. We'll go through at the end, Morgan will go through some resources, and some of that is like test taking tips. Don't leave answers blank. How do you narrow things down? So we'll talk through that today, but you will have, pretty much ample time. I do hear from people, and it was my experience, you should plan to really use your whole time. It seems like, wow, that's a long time for this, but you probably should plan on taking most of the time allotted. So we're going to sort of jump into content. Again, for those of you who have taken the test prior to this year, this may look a little bit different. There's more categories than there were, and some things have been shifted. Not super important to try to figure out exactly where questions are going to fit, but this is helpful to think about, the biggest categories are, fundamental planning knowledge, policy, plan and plan development, plan implementation, areas of practice, communication, interaction. So those are really probably where you want to focus most of your energy. And we'll go through each of these here. So research and assessment methods is, just over 10%. So you can expect questions about how would you gather data? How would you conduct research, kind of high level? What do you need to know about data sources, interpreting data? What might not be great data sources? How would you conduct and use spatial analysis in the planning process? There will be community involvement engagement techniques will show up here, but it'll also show up in a few other sections. So this might be, how would you set up community engagement? How would you involve harder to reach populations? And then again, what are some specific strategies you can use for data collection? This is a big one, fundamental planning knowledge. A lot of what's here are what we kind of refer to as the gimmies. I think someone, maybe it was you, Paul, asked the question of like, how deep do we need to get into some of the things? This is some of it, who's known as the father of planning, who is credited with these different theories and movements. So some of those are just, unfortunately, memorization. So this is when Morgan shares some of her tips. This is where, flashcards and sort of just some of that, how do you maybe use a mnemonic device to remember something around theory, around, years that things happened, around basic tenets of certain planning movements, around definitions for things, terminology, around principles for related professions. I mean, I don't think we need to, this isn't a professional engineering exam. We don't need to go into a lot of detailed calculations but we do need to know about, how those related professions interact with us. This is where you might talk a little bit about technology and how we'd use technology, where we talk about federal enabling legislation. And so some of those higher level kind of what we learn in Planning 101, planning history, planning law. Communication and interaction. This is really, I think, one of the sections that they changed up a little bit, quite a bit actually, thinking about how we make our communication more culturally appropriate, how we're more inclusive and diverse, how we're really practicing listening. So all those skills that are super important as planners, how we would apply those through a communication lens. This is where you'll see questions on leadership and social justice, decision-making and sort of different ways of decision-making in group settings. Again, you see outreach and engagement strategies coming up again here. So this might be more tools and techniques, looking for evidence-based arguments, and then obviously thinking about how to manage politics and what you as a planner really need to know in terms of kind of that situational management. Plan and policy development is another really big one. And so this is where we would talk about plan preparation, the planning process, things that we need to know about policy development, thinking about state and federal laws. Again, this isn't going to ask specific questions about specific state laws because this is a national exam, but kind of generally about state and federal laws. So Paul, to your question, this is one you need to know sort of the basics. I wouldn't spend time looking at every 50 states enabling legislation to know the ins and outs of that. That's not what this is really about. Thinking about equity, thinking about ways to resolve conflict, thinking about ways to involve, again, different people, looking at best practices, innovation. So this is one where I would assume there could be some new test questions related to, kind of some of the newer topics that planning is tackling. Looking at funding and financing, looking a little bit at community character and form, probably building a little bit more on some of the more historical patterns of human settlement that we might have seen in the previous category. And then again, really figuring out how planning and answering questions about how planning can be used to help, again, foster more diversity, equity, and inclusion and address maybe some systematic issues that we've had in the past that have perpetuated inequality and discrimination. So you'll see some of that here. And that's, again, looking at it through the lens of the planning process. Plan implementation, they sort of broke this category out, which is great because, for me as a planner, I think this is arguably one of the most important things we need to know how to do as planners. But In this section, you'll be asked about developing and interpreting policies, regulations, and programs. You'll be asked about funding, how might you implement a plan through funding decisions, through a capital improvement program, things like that. You might be asked about partnerships, assignments, resourcing, looking at monitoring, tracking, metrics, evaluation, and then, thinking about how your plans can ensure effectiveness. So kind of some of the basic implementation 101 here. Administration and management is not a huge section, but you could be expected to answer general questions on program management, general project management. Again, we're not becoming certified project managers through this test, but kind of some basics. Thinking about organizational management, maybe some different tools and techniques, relationships, the importance of mentoring in planning, and then accountability. Leadership is also not a huge category, but covers, pretty broad range of topics, thinking about how you get leadership on board for plan implementation, preparation, thinking about advocacy and what our role as planners might be, and that obviously there are specific questions from the Code of Ethics that could address this, but this also could show up in this section. Thinking about problem solving, decision making, what as planners we can do from a mentoring perspective, not a mentoree perspective. What's the importance of professional development, and as planners, how might we support that? And then in terms of volunteering, so you might get questions related to what's appropriate, what's not appropriate in some of these situations. Areas of practice is sort of a catch-all. Planning is such a diverse profession, and I think if we went around, we could probably all talk about sort of what one of our specialties is. But you can see here, this really is anything that you could be expected as a professional planner to specialize in, right? You might specialize in housing, food access, hazard mitigation, economic development. You might be a current or operational planner, a long-range planner. You might focus on historic preservation. You might focus more on capital improvements and infrastructure, parks. You might be a rural, small town or resort town planner. And obviously, transportation, urban design, those types of things. So, this is sort of really, I would say, understanding current trends, thinking about what planners do on a day-to-day basis. I don't think you're going to be expected to be an expert in every single one of these things, but again, knowing a little bit about what each of these areas is focused on would be helpful. Code of conduct and ethics is 10%. This is a pretty important one. It's also a pretty challenging one. So this is one where we can talk through some of the questions. There's a great book, Practicing Ethics for Everyday Ethics for Practicing Planners, that can kind of, if you guys have had a chance to look at that, kind of go through some of those different situations and scenarios and really help you think about how you would apply the Code of Conduct and Code of Ethics to that. I will note that the Code of Ethics is being updated, has been updated. It's our understanding that it's the 2016 version that's being used for the test. Although I don't think the changes are that substantial, that something that was ethical is now unethical and vice versa. So this is really one of those where it's helpful to take practice exams to sort of see how the questions are written and how they expect you to answer. But, really what we're focused on is as a certified planner, what is your responsibility to the public? What's your responsibility to the profession? And what's your responsibility to your employer or your client? And thank you, Morgan, for pasting that link in. So that's a book that might help you prepare for this one. Is helpful to memorize or familiarize yourself with the Code of Conduct and Code of Ethics. I think there was a question when someone registered. You're not going to be required to say, section, number this, number that. Like, it's not that type of question. These questions are really, a lot of them are situational. So in this case, what would this planner be expected to do? And you may be asked, you know, for example, if you're convicted of a serious crime, you'll have your certification suspended. I think there's lots of other reasons not to be convicted of serious crimes, but in my mind, like this is one of them. So you could be asked a question like that, you know, related to the code. And yes, Nate, you're correct. There are the aspirational principles and the rules. So familiarize yourself with both of those. So we are about to shift into practice test review. We did email you that. I know some of you registered later than when I sent out the email, and we had a little bit of issue with, frankly, me not looking at date stamps. So I acknowledge some of you have not had time to complete this, which is totally fine. We'll go through it together. It's 48 questions. So again, you'll recall I mentioned this is sort of proportional in terms of like take an hour to complete this test. And then we will probably take more than an hour to go through it because we'll discuss and have, you know, kind of rationale discussions on why you would pick one thing over another. But this will give you an idea of a similar ratio, right? If you take an hour to complete 48 questions, you can take 3.5 hours to complete the exam. So with that, does anyone want or need a short break? Are we still doing good? We don't normally program breaks in here, so just take care of yourself. If you need more coffee, you need to do something for yourself, just feel free to go in and do that. Just turn your camera off. So what we're going to do is we'll go through these practice questions. I will start with the first few, and then Morgan, Kate, and I will just sort of rotate. We'll look for a volunteer. You can just say the answer if you know it. If no one wants to volunteer, we might ask someone if they have thoughts. And then we'll spend some time. This first question is one that always elicits a lot of conversation. So we'll spend some time, you know, you might not get the right answer. We'll spend some time talking about why that's the right answer from the test perspective, which I realize sometimes can be frustrating. I mean, there's lots of nuances. And so that's something to be aware of when you're taking the test, is reading questions carefully. So this first question, which type of zoning allows a mixture of uses, promotes flexibility in design and density? Does anyone have thoughts on what this might be and want to take a shot?
And anybody can throw out the answer. The group is small enough that that's absolutely appropriate.
Yeah, just unmute yourself and shout it out.
And there's zero judgment. My friends from the Springs know that we have that space, but zero judgment. So throw out your answer.
PUD.
Okay, we heard PUD. And I heard someone else.
Yeah, PUD I was leaning towards.
So this is a really tricky one. The answer for the test is actually C, overlay zone. And this is one, you know, I know we've got, I'll be completely frank, we've gotten criticism on this, like this is BS, like this is exactly why I don't want to take the test, and that's fine. This is one you have to read carefully, because I think the way that the test looks at this is it's specifically asking you for a type of zoning. And I think you could argue that PUD is a type of process, right? PUD can be zoning. It can also be a process. So in full disclosure, this is one that I got wrong when I took the practice test. So the answer is overlay, and really that's, you know, I think you can sort of also argue that overlay would work. But again, for me, the way that I sort of look to this one is it's asking for a specific type of zoning. We know TDR isn't a type of zoning. Pyramid zoning is a type of zoning, but that's not clearly the answer. Overlay zones are something that, you know, you implement through a zoning code. And so that's why that is the best answer. Morgan, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I was going to say it's also a perfect example of why you do not want to personalize the questions to your practice where either you work or currently worked. And not wanting, again, I don't want to answer this in the way where it's personal, but just being mindful of what, and as Erin said, what's the function of each of these potential answers? You're also looking for the more correct. The test is written in a way where it's trying to get you to think, and there could be several right answers, but you're picking the most right, which is so kind of them. But with design, that may not be something that's rooted in zoning, but is something that you would have on top of the zone district. So just thinking through all of that, which will take some extra time, which is why it's important to just breathe through everything and think through it, again, not making it personal to the jurisdiction or wherever it is that you work. Melissa?
So if everybody gets this question wrong on the exam, do they throw it out like they do with the other standard exams? Or do they just say, well, everyone got it wrong, so maybe we shouldn't ask that question again?
So that's a good question, Melissa. And I think this is how they test questions. So, you know, right now we mentioned they added a bunch of new questions. They're sort of always refreshing the exam, and they do benchmark them, right? So, you know, in all honesty, this could be a question that is not on the exam because, you know, 75% of people get it wrong. So I think they do sort of weight questions. They do evaluate that. We should also mention, don't expect to see these 48 questions on your exam, right? I mean, for those of you who've been studying and maybe taken practice tests, you could be lucky enough that some of those exact questions are on your exam, but more likely than not, that's not the case. So yes, they do take questions off. They do add new questions. I would assume, especially with the questions, you know, those practice questions that they're sort of testing, if a question like this came up and they're like, wow, 90% of people got it wrong, we'd be like, that's not probably a great question, you know?
Okay.
This question, on the other hand, is much more objective. Who authored the image of the city?
Kevin Lynch.
Good job. Perfect. You just got that question right. You got a point.
Cute little blue book with some white building sketches on it. It's a great read.
So these are those things like Paul, you were suggesting, you know, how deep do we need to get? Well, this is like a question where you don't really need to get that deep, even if you haven't read the image of the city, which based on Johnny's recommendation, it sounds like we all should. You just need to know that he's the one that authored it, right? That's what's important here. Okay. So let me see if I can, let me move this down because it's kind of covering questions. So which employee-focused TDM strategies are commonly used specifically for commute trip reductions? And this is a typical question structure that you'll see where it is multiple choice, but the responses aren't just, is it 1, 2, or 3, 1, 2, 3, or 4? It's, is it this and this, this, or this? So read this question carefully and then let us know when you think you have the correct answer. And again, feel free to shout it out.
I put D, 3 and 4.
That's correct, Mel. And what led you to, what was your thought process behind that?
Focusing on just commute trip reduction, which ones specifically relate to that?
That's perfect. And then also, you know, reading like employee focused TDM, you know, unbundled parking costs potentially could also be commute trip reduction, but that'd usually be on the employer side, right? So good thought process.
And what's TDM? Was it travel demand management? I'm guessing, but what was TDM? Sorry.
Yes, transportation demand management, travel demand management.
Got
Maybe
it.
for some of our transportation, who's a transportation planner here? Usually we have like several of them. Interestingly, we don't today. Okay. Yeah, I think it's travel demand management or transportation demand management. I don't know specifically if it's one of the two. I feel embarrassed saying that, but okay.
I believe it's the former. It's transportation demand management as
Okay.
definitions.
That's what I thought acronyms. It was, but
yeah.
we'll go ahead and do a little Googling here on our next question. Okay.
And I'll say something to be mindful of whenever there are several different forms of the exam. So whenever I took it, it was more focused on transportation, which is super cool since I'm not a transportation planner. But as Aaron has gone over, the purpose of the exam is to have some knowledge of all the different fields of planning. So if there is something that you are less familiar with, focusing on that to become familiar with the terminology, different theories, those kinds of things. So if maybe you're super strong in environmental planning, looking more at public participation, if it's not something that you're so much doing because it's more of a piece of the whole project. So just being mindful of that as you are studying. And I'm going to take the next few questions. So number 4, what is the floor area ratio of the building shown below? And just throw out your answer when you are ready.
That's B.
It is B. And how did you come to that answer?
If it were the entire lot, it would become one story.
Mm-hmm. Yes. It's yes, Zach. And that wasn't intended to put you on the spot, but explain math to us. But these are things that pretty standard, but can trip you up when you're in that frame of mind of, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, I'm taking the exam. Again, breathe, kind of look through this and think through it. FAR is one of those things that's pretty standard for planning, but if there is any confusion, please reach out to somebody, any of us, if there are any questions. So I don't want to move forward if there are. But doesn't look
this is a good example too of the type of math that you'll be doing on the exam. You know, you're not going to be asked to do like super complex calculations, run a travel model, anything like that. But, you know, be prepared to calculate something simple, moderately simple like this.
Yes, yes.
I don't know. There was a practice exam in the Plan Citizen course, and they were asking like, what is the formula for such and such? And it was like, honestly, in 12-point font, it was like 3 inches long.
Really? Well, yeah. Chelsea, I will say that I did the Plan study course, and I feel like it was way more in depth than what you'll have on the actual exam. And I think it's the thought behind that is to prepare you so that you've been, and I talked to Paul about this the other day, that you're studying at this high level of, oh my gosh, this is really intense. But once you get to the exam, it's more simplified, a more simplified version of the practice exams. So if that's what you had on your practice, it was most likely intentional so that you're like, oh my gosh, this is what FAR is. But then when you get to the real test, this is the kind of question that you have.
Okay, yeah. And it's having a fun effect on me because then I overthink things.
I know. So I know. As I told Paul, and I want to share this with you all, you know, I am going to go over resources at the end, but because it's come up, when you take the practice exams, do not let them psych you out if you're not doing well in the practice exams that, wow, I'm failing these or I'm just barely passing. That is intentional. I don't think I passed any of the practice exams. And so there was a lot of crying on my end. But when I got to the real exam, it was, oh, this was much easier. Again, my experience, but just something to be mindful of. So please do not let it psych you out in that way.
Okay, thank you.
I do think, Chelsea, you bring up a good point though. Like, don't want to imply that the only math you would do is something this simple. There could be something, even an FAR question that gives you square foot and then asks you for, you know, FAR, you know, gives you a mixture of like square foot and acreage. You need to do some like conversions and then arrive at FAR. Like there could be, you know, something that's slightly more complex than something this simple. But memorizing, you know, 5-line formulas, I don't think you necessarily need to worry about. So.
Yeah, cool. Because that's why I got into planning.
Right. That's why we're not in engineering, all
right.
Engineers, right? Yeah.
Cool. Thank you both.
Fair assessment, Chelsea. Okay. Question 5. What book did the father of regional planning write? So this is one who you'll need to know who that person is and what is their book. Any thoughts on this?
I think it's A, Cities in Evolution.
It absolutely is, Chelsea. Yes. So this is
Chelsea.
One of those that just memorizing the fact. Sorry, Erin.
So I was just going to ask Chelsea, do you know who's considered the father of regional planning? You know the book, obviously.
Patrick Geddes, I think.
Great. So that's another, Morgan will talk about resources as we've mentioned, but that's another, like, maybe you might be lucky enough to get a Patrick Geddes question later. And if you've already known this, that'll help you. So again, sort of, unfortunately, some of those memorization things.
All right.
I was gonna say, has anyone taken a question where the actual answer was Devil in the White City? Because that's been like a throw it out every single question for me so far.
What do you like when you're taking the practice? It's
like I feel like they throw in this book that's not written by a planner about a planning thing that has to do with a serial killer.
Yeah, Johnny.
It's a great book, though.
Yeah.
And it's phenomenal. It got me into planning. And it's also the only way that I remember Daniel Barnum, the Chicago World's Fair, and everything else related to it.
And there's a movie coming.
Yeah.
Keanu Reeves.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yes. But that's a very good question, Melissa. Excellent add-on to that. It's intentional. I know in school we had to read Devil in the White. So it's one of those things that people who are taking the exam are most likely mindful or know what it is, but it's one of those things that's, it's here to trip you up. So just be prepared for that. So question 6, what can be described as a budget that reflects one-time major expenditures to be used over a long period of time? The pause was intentional.
Capital budget.
Yes, capital budget. And why is that the correct answer?
Because it's a budget that reflects one-time major expenditures.
Yes, and yes, I'm not trying to be goofy about it, but capital budget, so those who work for jurisdictions or are familiar with budgeting, you're looking at something over a long period of time. So it's not just these quick little pieces, but an overall doing it one time. And I know that I'm just repeating how the question is written, but something to be mindful of when you're going through the finance study pieces and those types of questions.
And I also think, to Nate's point, process of elimination is really important on this test. And you know that an operating budget is not a one-time expenditure. It's not necessarily major, right? That's just what you do annually. And then if you know kind of the acronym PPBS, Planning, Programming, and Budgeting System, that also doesn't really seem to fit the bill in terms of a one-time major expenditure. So you can easily eliminate those two. Okay.
All right. A strategic plan involves 1, 2, 3, or 4. So one of those questions of needing to read through everything, understanding what the acronyms mean. So I'll give you a little time for this one. So any thoughts on the answer here of what a strategic plan involves? And we recognize that the responses, so in this PowerPoint, B, C, D, E, I know what you mean if versus A, B, C.
Yeah, I don't even know how that happened. I'm gonna just go ahead and correct that while we're sitting here.
Yeah, one other thing I noticed in the practice test, just the numbers don't line up for the options, and it has like 5, 6, 7, 8 on top, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 below, just in the Word document that was sent out.
Oh gosh.
Oh, so formatting.
Yeah, just like the numbers are off, but it's still, yeah.
Okay.
I put D 2, 3, 4.
Yes, you are correct. Any thoughts on that one?
So are you 100% sure on that, Morgan? Our test guide says it's all of the above.
Yes, and well, and it
okay.
is, yeah, so D, all the above.
Okay.
Sorry.
Oh. Yeah, in the test it says D. Or in the, yeah.
Yeah,
okay.
You're right.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, ignore my last 30 seconds.
But any thoughts on that, Mel?
I guess the first one like trips me up a little bit in thinking about, is a strategic plan broader or more limited?
It could, yes. Great answer, right? Yeah, so strategic plan could be something that is really broad, or it's honing it in on those specific focuses. So again, you don't want to make these questions personal. However, if there is experience that you can draw upon, it would be helpful in this type of situation. So strategic planning could be comparable to comprehensive planning, coming up with, we've got this plan, how do we plug in all the other pieces? And with that, it could be something that spans over a long period of time, or it could just be for a limited amount. Okay.
Thank you. Sorry about that, guys.
No, you're fine.
Okay, I think we're turning it over to Kate.
Yep, so I've got the next question, and a variance can be described as?
A.
Did you say A, Melissa? Yep, that's correct. Woohoo. All right, number 9. Of the following growth management techniques, which would likely be used to reduce development density?
C.
Yep, that is correct.
So if folks have questions or maybe had a different thought, just make sure to stop us and we can talk through these, okay?
All right, number 10. For which of the following demographic groups is a male survey instrument most effective?
A.
Correct. Old people love mail. I love mail too, though, so I don't know.
I would chime in to this and say this is a good process of elimination question, and just thinking about the different types of demographics that actually use mail. Like they're gonna ask a few of these types of questions in participation and surveying, and just knowing how APA answers the qualifications for how people get responses is a really good strategy into this one.
Yeah, absolutely.
What I was going to say. So for those who have several projects working for wherever it is that you work, thinking of how your notification process works. Kate, Johnny, and I are very mindful of this. If you have mailed notices, who are those who are the most vocal based on the postcards or letters that they receive?
All right. Green infrastructure really gives you a lot to go off of. Any thoughts?
Is it C, all of them?
Correct. Yep. So green infrastructure does all the things.
And with this one, knowing what, the opposite. So if you have gray infrastructure, thinking of those kinds of things, that gray infrastructure, focusing on the actual pipe or something, so that could be eliminated, but just drawing on all of the other information that is hopefully up there rattling in your brain.
Okay. So I think our first law question, in which case did the Supreme Court say that a community may prohibit unrelated individuals from living as a family in the same house?
So I had a question on this one because this is one that I had flagged to go back and Google, and from just Googling them and reading quick briefs, it looked like A and B both pertain to this issue.
So I kind of think that they both deal with the same thing, but I think A, that case was more, it allowed us, it concerned the definition of a family, and the other one, the Belterre case, I think had to do with like college students at Stony Brook living together and then prohibiting that to maintain character or something. So
you're right, Johnny.
With B.
So the answer is B, Village of Belterre. The other thing that I would look at is, so say you didn't remember that, but you were like, oh, both of these cases related to a family. You can also look at the dates, right? Because Belterre occurred first. You're right that in Belterre, it restricted one family dwellings to a single family, which was defined as one or more persons related by blood, adoption, or marriage, living and cooking together, or two people unrelated. Whereas the other case, Moore versus East Cleveland, was really talking about a grandparent-grandchild relationship, and that prohibition was unconstitutional. So in that case, the individuals were related by blood, right? So again, maybe thinking about process of elimination and looking at the dates. And then hopefully you can eliminate, the other two because they're, not really related to unrelated individuals living together.
Thanks.
Does that answer that question, Chelsea?
Yeah, I think I just need more focus on law. It's my weak spot, or it's one of my weak spots, I guess.
Well, not all of us are going to be land use attorneys, right? That's fine. Okay, so this next question is regarding the 2010 census. I will tell you, obviously we have a new census that has come out. I think those questions will start to be incorporated. But again, trends are really what you're looking for here. We're not going to be asked specific, percentages of population. It's my understanding that we don't have a ton of questions, if any, graded questions related to the 2020 census. So I wouldn't be surprised if you saw general census questions on the exam. In this question, it's asking what the 2010 census revealed about which of the following is correct. And let me go to the next. Oh wait, nope, sorry. I thought this was one of those multiple ones, but.
Is it B?
Say that again.
Is it B? Sorry, it's really loud here.
Yeah, sorry, I just didn't know if you said B or D. Yes, B, an increasing diversity of the population. So this is one that we'd want to make sure we were looking to the 2010 census and not the 2021, because that could change the response. Good job, Zach. Okay, I think this is still me. Sorry, like I said, have 3 screens here. Kate or Morgan, if I start answering one of your questions, asking one of your questions, just shout it out. In drafting a neighborhood plan, what's the most efficient and effective way to ensure that the interests of all groups have been addressed?
I went back and forth between B and C, but I chose B.
And you are correct. So what ultimately helped you choose B?
It said prior to drafting the plan, and C didn't say anything about when, because C would be good, but not if you did it after you had already drafted something.
That seems like a rational way of thinking. Good job. And then some of the others, again, we can eliminate, right? If we're holding a public hearing, we probably are holding that, but you know, that's not really helping in the drafting of the plan. You know, in A, it's really focused on specific groups and written comments. So I think we can easily eliminate some of those.
Well, and also with this still being in draft form, there wouldn't be anything that you could send to the different groups. And if you're going to public hearing, the thought is that it's finished. So again, they're intentionally tricky. Do what?
Well, and even in A, it's like you're sending a copy of the plan.
Yeah.
That means you've already done
Right.
the plan, and if you're trying to get input, hopefully you're doing that prior to drafting a plan. You know, the other thing I would say about C is if you're conducting statistically valid opinion polls, you know, you might do that in addition, but you're not necessarily getting all groups, right? So a little bit nuanced, but I think in this case, B is the best answer, right? Okay. A planner's primary obligation is?
C.
Correct. Primary obligation, keyword, right? Okay.
And that's where memorizing the code of ethics comes in. So question 16, the intensity of residential land use is typically measured by which of the following methods?
C.
C is correct, yes. Not much discussion on that one, unless anybody has some questions to throw out. Okay.
I have a question. Oh,
yeah.
So why is it, I chose C, but why is it not FAR?
Because this question is focusing on the development itself and how dense it is. So how many, and I hate to use the answer in my explanation, but the dwelling units per acre is focusing on, so when you're looking at a development, lower density, larger lots, higher density, smaller lots, maybe it is something that has a higher FAR. So there are different components that could be worked into this. But when you want to measure what is that intensity of the development, you're looking at the DUs per acre. So that's not, it's taking out right of way, open space, the different everything else. But in the most basic level, DUs per acre is how you're going to focus or account for what the intensity of the development is.
And I think typically in most, you know, this says typically measured.
Typically.
I think it's much less common to use FAR for residential development. FAR is usually a measure for non-residential.
Yep.
You know, because really what people are interested in is how many units. Again, here, I think you can easily eliminate open space ratio. You can easily eliminate impervious surface area ratio. Not that you wouldn't also calculate those in your planning, but in terms of measuring intensity, it's either going to be FAR or density. And in almost every code, you know, you have residential zone districts are literally named with their densities, right? I mean, we're getting away from that probably a little bit, but FAR is a much more typical measure for non-residential. And so that's really the key here is like, not that you couldn't use FAR, but you more typically use DUs.
Yes.
And that's really what they're looking for.
Okay, that was my reasoning too, was that FAR is less common in general, but I just wanted to understand more.
Yeah. Good thought process.
And I'm really glad that Erin said, because yes, this is one of those things that until someone actually says it, like, oh yeah, that's exactly. FAR is not how residential land use is reviewed. That's more of like multifamily, high density, something that you would kind of envision to be in the downtown core, maybe. Okay. Sorry, I'm clicking, I have multiple things up too. Which of the following best describe the composition of the block highlighted below? So you may need to do a little sketching here.
C.
Yes, it is C. And why is it C, Mel?
I think I kind of just went more process of elimination than trying to really spend time calculating, but showing like the park and retail, it's not the same, but it's not. But then like I eliminated D also because 65% seemed high and then 15% seemed low.
Yes. And also being mindful of what those colors mean, because they are, you know, national standard. Essentially, that green is for park or open space, yellow is single family, and red is for commercial or retail.
All right. And then one further distinction, multifamily is usually brown. You might see that as like a brown color. And yeah, the typical single family residential is yellow. So the higher density, it gets darker.
Good point.
So question 18, a stratified sampling is when you ...
A.
Yes, it is A.
Any questions on this one? I know not every planner is involved in like data collection, so if you have questions. Okay.
All right. Which of the following are included in subdivision regulations? And again, this is one of those where you're looking at everything and mark out what it isn't. What are these different things?
I went for C just because 3 and 4 didn't click with me.
Okay. Any other thoughts from the group?
I did D.
You did D, and how did you get to that answer?
Seems like they could all be in there, whether or not one city has them or the other.
Okay. Yes. Any other thoughts? Because this is one of those where obviously at least one of them is going to apply.
I picked D because I knew 2 and 3 were part of it, and that was the only answer that had 2 and 3.
Okay. All right. Paul, what questions do you have on this one?
None. I just need to study up on the relationship with those last two.
Okay. One thing to think
D.
about. You might remember that question we had early on about which of the following could be considered a growth management technique, and the response was large lot subdivision. And so if you kind of think back to that, it's like, okay, that's a growth management technique. That's regulating how we subdivide the lots. So therefore, not all growth management controls would be in a subdivision regulation, but some growth management controls could be part of your, how you subdivide. Paul, this is kind of a tricky one because, I would say clearly and I think Mel, or maybe that was Melissa, like, okay, I know that impact fees are too. So it has to be all of the above because that's the only choice that has that. But I think, for me, obviously the first two are, so then it would be either between C or D, and you'd really have to like think critically about could either of these, be included? And if so, you'd have your answer, right?
So what I struggled with for this one is that 3 could also be regulated by a different agreement. And so it's the word are in the question, like which of the following are, as in are always. And so that's how my mind interpreted it. And that's why I went with C. And I understand the reasoning for why it's D, but this one definitely tripped me up.
Yeah, I think this is a challenging question. I mean, you're right. You all are right. Any, like, there could be different ways of looking at this. So I think it's really, you know, I hate to say this, but it's sort of like, what would APA do? You know, and it's like, how would they think about this holistically? Again, to your point, not every community is going to have all of these things in their subdivision regulations, but subdivision regulations do include all those things, right? So again, to Morgan's earlier point, you know, when we were thinking about PUD versus overlay zone, try not to, especially if you've worked in a community for a number of years, try not to personalize this to your code and regs. Try to think about it more broadly. Okay, let's go on. I think we're turning this over to you, Kate.
Yep, next. An LOSC at a signalized intersection indicates. Again, no transportation planners on the
Is it A?
Today. It is A, that is correct.
I know that, I just know that it goes from A to F, and C, level of service C, is kind of in the middle of that. So A seems correct. I don't know all of the classification stuff. Transportation or
yeah.
So that's a really great way to think about it, Zach. Like, you know, I don't really know exactly what all the definitions are, but like we all know what the grading system is, right? So what seems the most average, right?
Yeah.
Good job.
See, I picked C for that same reason, because I figured F is when you don't move. And D is, like, I looked at the near roadway capacity as C, because C is technically passing still under most circumstances. So what level of service would answer C be? Is that a D or an F?
So that would probably be,
I'd say that'd probably be D, or, I mean.
Yeah. Because answer D, very low speeds, volumes greater than capacity, frequent stoppages, that would be an F. That is like totally, you know, there's work that needs to be done to improve traffic conditions. So unstable flow, I would imagine is probably closer to that, like D range, yeah.
Okay. Got it.
All right. A complete submission for a site plan review should provide each of the following types of information except
C.
That is correct. So listing specific rents and things like that, it's not generally required information to evaluate a site plan. Clarence Perry's neighborhood unit was
Picked D, but I don't like this question.
well, D is the correct answer. And this is a little bit of a tricky question, because it goes back to some of that information before, that is some of the memorization pieces of what is Clarence Perry's neighborhood unit, and then which of these answers satisfies what that neighborhood unit model is. And so this is a weird one, because it kind of requires you to really dig into your brain a little bit and not only know neighborhood unit is a type of land use pattern that has been thought of in planning, but what are the components of that, and which of those components satisfies the answer here. So this is definitely like a tricky one that requires you to go back and think through all the different pieces of the model.
What didn't you like about this one, Melissa?
Because technically I thought the neighborhood unit had a church in the middle, but it could be replaced by a school. That was what like the Planet is in course that I literally listened to this yesterday morning said. And that was why I didn't like this question. Because that school in the middle is not necessarily the requirement. It was like a substitution for a church. But it still was a civic use, so that's why I picked it.
I was going to say civic. Yeah.
And I think the other thing is the neighborhood unit contained parks, open space, right? That was another kind of component that's not in here. But if you get to that point, Melissa, and think like, oh, it's supposed to be a church, I think you could think like, okay, both are civic uses. I'm going to go with that, right?
Okay. All right. And which of the following is a landmark housing case? I'm sorry, whoever responded, could you say that again?
Is it C?
It is C, that is correct. NAACP versus Mount Laurel. That is a housing case out of New Jersey.
And so did you know that because you know that case, or did you use process of elimination?
I know the case because it's the one about discrimination based off of housing. I get this one and the other one mixed up about if you can discriminate. There's another case that's similar, that's you can't discriminate, or you can't de facto discriminate, or maybe you can. But I knew that NAACP was a case. I just didn't remember which one specifically referenced.
Well, luckily the other case wasn't on here, so you were able to get this. Great job. Okay, next question. The three levels of the ladder of participation are, we have a fun multiple choice again here.
D.
That's correct, Johnny. Questions or discussion about this one? Okay, nice job. Okay, so this is a longer question. You're newly appointed planning director in the small town of Buckville. Your husband's also the new owner of a gardening store that's applying for construction of a greenhouse to be built adjacent to the store. This will need to be reviewed by the Planning Commission for approval. In this example, you should do which of the following? So this is one of our ethics questions. What would you do in this case?
D.
Seems decently straightforward. Does that seem reasonable to everyone?
I think C would be nice, but it's not ethical.
Would be nice. Maybe having the commissioners grow flowers would also be nice, but we're not going to do that. We're going to inform them and remove ourselves from the process. Okay, who's considered the father of zoning?
Bassett.
Yep. Lots of other important B men, but Bassett is the father of zoning. Oh, sorry, wrong screen. It's a little bit tricky. What housing act focused on slum clearance?
Is it C?
That's the correct answer. How'd you get to that, Mel?
I think when I was studying, it seemed like timeline-wise, kind of acts prior to the 50s were more focused on clearance, and then after that were improved.
Yeah. Yeah, so in 49, federal financing for slum clearance programs, and that again associated with urban renewal. So you're right, like in terms of the timeline, that one makes most sense. 54 created public housing, 64 was the Federal Fair Housing Act. And then in 70, it raised the ceiling on guarantees, which, you know, ushered in sort of being able to do much more large scale projects. So good thinking on that one.
Okay, so what month has the APA designated as National Community Planning Month?
October.
It is October. I was gonna go a little hint of what days today. Yes, October. All right. According to ITE's trip generation, blank trips per day per dwelling unit will be generated by single family homes. Any thoughts on this one?
So I know we don't have transportation planners in this group. Melissa, it looks like you might have a response.
I said C, 4.2, but that still seems low.
It is. So something with this, and I'm going to put in the chat, just like typical averages. So the answer is A. And the way to remember this is as the buildings get taller, the trips get smaller. So having the single family home, there's more of a need for driving rather than a high-rise apartment. So just one of those memorization things. Yeah.
I think you can also think not only as buildings get taller, but as units get smaller, you typically have less people per household. So you can imagine,
yes,
you know, in a single family home, that's kind of in theory, the largest family size, right? So people would be making work trips, school trips, you know, family trips. So you don't need to memorize the trip generation manual, but just be thinking about the types of, you know, think about when peak hour trips occur. So kind of those general trends.
All right. Who was involved with an organizational approach that has invitation, sent out by the neighborhood or organization, and a paid organizer is then sent to the neighborhood? So some of your history. Anyone familiar with who established this?
B.
B, yes, that is correct. Again, another one just to memorize of who did what. So going through that, those are kind of the gimme questions that you'll have on your exam. All right, what does zip code stand for?
A.
Yes, it is A. Another one to memorize. Thanks, Mel.
I think I had this in a trivia once.
You did? Well, look at you.
That's a crazy trivia question.
I would say so.
So again, this is one, like, if you think about, like, obviously we know the zip code is through the post office. The post office doesn't really care about zoning, right? So like you can eliminate two of them. And then if you're tasked with, well, gee, is it A or C? Well, again, the post office probably doesn't care about planning, right? So might be able to, even if you hadn't had it as trivia, might be able to get this one through process of elimination.
Can confirm with the Colorado Springs post office, they do not care. And my friends here know that painfully.
I don't think the post office cares about anything.
They
anymore.
don't, but the one here is just.
All right, I've got the next one. This is a long question. You are a village planner scheduled to attend a planning commission meeting to provide staff recommendation on a PC case. Prior to the meeting, you receive a phone call from a friend and colleague who is a planner in a nearby community. She tells you that she has some dirt on the petitioner scheduled to present the case. She says that you won't believe your ears, and although this information is confidential, you have to hear it. You're afraid that this could impact your staff recommendation. What should you do?
D, tell her to come to the public hearing.
That is correct. It is D. Okay. An environmental impact statement can be defined as which of the following?
B.
Say that again, Chelsea. I'm sorry.
B, the second choice.
B as in boy. That is correct. Written to satisfy the requirements of NEPA when a major action will have significant impact on the environment. Can confirm these reports are very long and difficult to write, but they do satisfy all these requirements.
So if you haven't been working in this realm, what are some things that you might look at between these three answers to help you? And maybe Chelsea, how did you get to that answer?
So I think an EA comes before an EIS. So I could kind of mark out A because EIS is more intensive or extensive. And then C, it's written the same way, but it says to have no impact on the environment, and that's not right. So what would be?
Right, so that's a really good progression. You know, if you know that you're doing an EA first, and if there's no significant impact, which is sort of what C says, then why would you be doing an EIS, right? So that's a really good thought process. And, you know, even if a lot of people aren't directly involved with this kind of work. So I think that's a really great way to sort of whittle down your choices.
All right, next question. A nonconformity can be defined as?
A.
That.
So you have to read this really, this question really, the responses really carefully, because there's some key words in terms of sequencing.
I went with C.
With what letter, Chelsea?
C is in Chelsea.
Yes. Love that. And so C is the correct answer. And so Johnny, for A, so it included choice number 3, but in choice 1 it says where the structures were created after a zoning ordinance and is not in conformity with the provisions. So I guess, you know, on a technicality, I could see that being part of a nonconformity, but that would be a prohibited use that was developed not in conformance with the zoning code, where I guess 3 is more along the lines of that legal non-conforming use.
Yeah, the key word there, if you read choice 1, created after the ordinance. And so it non-conformities are always, they were conforming at one time, right? So they were allowed, they were legal, they were conforming. In this case, they were never conforming because they were created after the code, right? So to Kate's point, they're just prohibited or they're illegal or whatever. So that's why, like, in theory, yeah, they are non-conforming with the provisions of the code, but because they were created after, they can't be non-conforming, right? So that's a tricky one.
Yeah, I actually have a question, Erin, and I know I'm the speaker, but I'm thinking of this, and I can see Johnny's point for why he would choose A, because it's not describing this as a legal non-conforming, which would kind of be like that precursor word to give us the insight that C is the correct answer, where this is prior to the zoning. And so is there, I guess, generally accepted language that referring to a nonconformity specifically is always referring to a legal nonconformity where it was done or implemented prior to a zoning code? Is that maybe something that lost over time?
Yeah, I would say you bring up a really good point. And in most codes, there's legal non-conforming uses, legal non-conforming structures, and there's a defined process by which you establish that, right? But I would say generally, so most codes have that, but again, this is an instance maybe not to personalize it to your code, because I'm sure in Colorado Springs, it's legal non-conforming use, right? Some codes just have a chapter on non-conformities. And so that would be more general to say a use or a structure that was established under a previous code is considered non-conforming. So I think the key here, and how you have to read it again, what would APA think, right?
Yeah.
This was created after the ordinance was adopted. And so it was never conforming. So therefore it can't be non-conforming. The legality isn't in question. I mean, obviously it's illegal because it's not conforming and it has never conformed. But I think what they're looking for here is that time period. So it's very nuanced. They didn't ask about legally non-conforming, but they also did not ask about that. I know that sounds weird. I'm not a land use attorney, and so I don't know if in order for it to be a legal non-conforming use, it has to say legal non-conforming. I mean, you know, I know in the last jurisdiction I worked in, our code chapter was just non-conformities, right? And so we didn't have that specific additional word, right? Although that's what we meant. So that's what I would say to that.
You know, and when you add in the idea of annexations and de-annexations and re-annexations, it's really confusing.
Right, right. And when you add in, you know, not all places had zoning codes when they first started developing, right? And so they may never have been legally established because there may never have been a process, right? But they may just not conform to today's code, and therefore we'll let them continue, right? But certainly if you do something today that's not in conformance with your code, it's definitely not legal or conforming, right? So just make sure you read carefully, look for those words in terms of, especially on something like this. You know, you can see, this is sort of similar to that last question where we had, I mean, we have two answers that are pretty much the same, you know, in 1 and 3. What's different about them? It's like, well, one existed prior, one was created after. To me, that's a pretty key difference when we're talking about nonconformities, right? Okay. And no one likes dealing with non-conforming uses. So let's move on to the next question.
All right. So the next question, the polycentric concept can be described as which of the following?
I guess B.
B? Yes, that is the correct answer. It's B. Zach, can you maybe talk a little to, did you know that that was the polycentric concept, or did you use any process of elimination tools to get you to that answer?
No, I didn't use process of elimination. Well, I guess you could sing a single metropolitan region is obviously not correct, right? It's the poly part of the word that's multiple. But it makes sense thinking that having multiple centers is the same as multiple metropolitan regions, or a series of metropolitan regions.
Great. That's some great logic applied to finding the solution to this question.
Nice job.
Okay.
Hey, I'm going to step away just for 1 second. So take your time on this question. I just need a quick bio break.
Okay. All right. So this is another question, and we've got advantages of subdivision regulations include which of the following?
B.
B, that is correct. And Mel, was there any particular reasoning that you used when answering the question?
Process of elimination. I have heard some advice for this test to think like a communist, so we don't want to let developers design freely.
That is a totally fair point. Right. And so number 4, letting developers design freely eliminates C and D. And then, now you're left with A and B as possible answers. And through the process of elimination or identifying that 3 should also be an answer would help finalize the answer to the question.
I think like a planner, not necessarily a communist. Developers' main goal is profit, and we are to represent the public interest. So they're not always trying to do what is in the best, or they're not trying to do the best thing for the public interest, rather.
Right. And what my contribution to this, so the way that the question is framed, subdivision regulations. So that is a city requirement. And therefore, if the developer want to just do whatever they want, how 4 is worded that freely on their own, well, that's contrary to the regulation piece of that these are the established requirements whenever you are establishing a subdivision, which is the legal lot and record. So therefore, they're not able to just freely do whatever they want. If it is totally in line what they freely want to do with your regulations, sweet, but the likelihood is not super high. And I say that as someone who has worked for a developer. So, in not every way are they bad. However, yes, Johnny, they are looking to make a profit. It's their business. So process of elimination with that one.
Okay. So the next question, this is a strip of mostly level land bordering a stream or river subject to flooding. So definition question here.
Floodplain.
Yep, that is a floodplain. Pretty easy process of elimination. It says flood in the definition, right? The policy Delphi method can be defined as what? Anybody have an idea what the policy Delphi method is? Want to take a shot at this? So the answer to this one is A. It's successive rounds of argument and counter argument that work towards a consensus. So I think this is one, again, definition, figuring out this technique, right? And understanding what it is. Also potentially thinking about what some of the others might be in terms of a public participation process, a decision-making process that you would use, and being able to eliminate some that it is not. And you can also, you know, so for example, you could say, okay, well, D is really talking about a land use proposal. It's probably not a policy issue. You know, and so you could really just work towards eliminating here, but the correct answer is A. Which of the following are common principles of transit-oriented developments, or TOD? Got a number of different choices here. It's one of those fun multiple choice. And we will caution you, do not get tripped up by logistics on these questions. Like, you'll have pen and paper, or pencil and paper. If really think about, like, you don't want to make a mistake in your answer, even if you have the answer right. So make sure that you're closely looking at what your choices are.
Is it C?
Did you say C, Mel?
Yeah.
Yep, that's correct. So it's everything except 3, right?
Yep.
Any questions on this one? I know we've had questions on this in the past. Seem pretty straightforward.
I would just, yeah, I was deciding between B and C, just because selection 2, you know, access for vehicles and pedestrians, it doesn't seem intuitive to spotlight vehicles in the answer to this question, but they still are necessary even in TODs, right? And I guess you could interpret that as like mentioning not only vehicles but also pedestrians too, which is something that TODs do rather than traditional single-family residential development, right? So, yeah.
That's spot on, Zach, and that's the question that we've gotten a lot is, why would you include 2 if it includes vehicles? And I think the answer is, you know, a TOD can provide for all modes, right? In some ways, vehicles could include transit vehicles. You could easily have, you know, a park and ride at a TOD, a kiss and ride. And so not getting too hung up on that. And I think you're also spot on that it does call out pedestrians. And so that's certainly something we'd provide for at a TOD. So good rationale on that question, and one that could be a little bit tricky and has been tricky to folks in the past. Okay. Next question. These are deep lakes that have a low supply of nutrients and thus contain little organic matter.
A.
That's correct, Mel. How did you know that?
I think just from studying, but it's just such a random question. I feel like it's from like a high school test or something.
That one I kind of like, I thought of like atrophy, like, I don't know, and like dying and things that I don't know. For some reason, my mind made that connection.
So that's really good thought process on both of your parts. And I know in past workshops, we've had folks that really have like thought about what the root words are. And so that's, you know, even if you don't know, if you make that connection of like, oh, well, I know this means this, I can kind of apply that same thing. So yeah, either, you know, memorization of terms, understanding, you know, your Latin and Greek roots, whatever that is, and trying to get to it from that way. Or maybe if you really specialized in environmental planning, this might be an easy one for you.
Okay, this is one where you're going to need to use the pen and paper, pencil paper that they provide you on the exam.
Sorry,
for what is the range of the following data set?
D.
Yes, it is D. So mean, median, mode, those types of things, just be aware of them. We had them in school, prior to going to higher ed. So if needed, just brush up on those, because you may have a question and they're kind of those gimme ones. All right. This can be described as a device to provide flexibility within the zoning ordinance. So again, not using your personal terminology of wherever it is that you may work, but still contextually similar in most cases.
Let's see, variance.
So and I'll just go through this one. The correct answer is A, a special use permit. So a variance is something, and this is kind of where using the provided pen and paper may be beneficial. There was an earlier question about variance or hardships. So being mindful of what the main piece of a variance is, that having to prove up that there is a hardship. Yes, thank you, Erin. So variance would be the relief from a standard and proving up why the applicant cannot meet what has been established in the zoning ordinance. So with a special use permit, which is the correct answer here, this could also be called maybe a conditional use permit, something that is a little beyond what has been established within the zoning ordinance. So there's an expansion upon what is permitted. The non-conforming uses, we had great discussion about that. So if there are any questions about why that is not the correct answer, please throw those out there. And then subdivision regulations, we've also had a lot of questions on that. That's looking at how the legal subdivision of land and regulations that are associated with it. Does that kind of help you, Melissa? Hopefully.
Yes and no.
Okay.
Yes, because it explains why it's not variance.
Mm-hmm.
And this just sounds like it's just me personally. I wouldn't see a special use permit as flexibility.
Okay.
Because it's a long process that you would have to go through. Like, I see why it does provide flexibility, but it's also like a lot. Like special use permits or conditional use permits are a lot to go through, and they're not always flexible.
True, but
so
they could take a long time, yes. Or it could be something that's a little simple. So again, it's that tough piece of making the separation from just as a planner, which I think Johnny mentioned earlier, just thinking like the planner and APA, as Erin's mentioned, versus what a specific jurisdiction may have as part of their processes. But just remembering that with the variance, that is some sort of relief, proving up the hardship of why the standards cannot be met.
So I think it's helpful, Melissa, to think about something that's providing flexibility within the ordinance. And so you could, I tend to agree with you from a practical standpoint. I mean, especially conditional uses are typically not easy, right? But you could imagine that you could have a code that says, generally we won't allow outdoor uses here. But if you just get a special use permit for your outdoor seating, through the city clerk's office, like that's a flexible way to sort of allow something that wouldn't normally be allowed by zoning. It might not be an extensive process. To your point, there might be a more arduous, special use process. There might be a conditional use, but the thought is that it's providing that predictable flexibility to anyone through the code, right? Whereas a variance is a unique circumstance. It does offer flexibility in that, like, hey, I can't meet my setback because of a hardship I didn't create, right? But it's not providing flexibility to anyone. It's providing kind of a workaround or relief from a standard that someone can't meet because of a condition they didn't impose, right? And so I think the key is really looking at how would you do something throughout the code that could apply to anyone, and that would be through a special use process, right? So it's a bit nuanced, but I think I think the questions that you'll tend to see around variances, you know, would be around law, would be around the hardship test, would be around, you know, the relief piece, would be around, is it self-imposed? Those types of things that are really key for variances. So that might be another one where you kind of look at process of elimination. Okay.
All right. Which are the key points to writing a WBS? So this is where knowing what that stands for is very important. So anybody want to take this one?
Anyone know what a WBS is?
If it helps y'all get there, it's a work breakdown structure.
Just a total guess, but is it all of them?
It is all of them, yes. Yes. So any thoughts on this one, or are y'all thinking, well, I just need to memorize it, let's move on?
I have really no idea what a work breakdown structure is.
There's a pretty good Wikipedia page on it.
But
thank you, Chelsea. If you want to put the link in, that'd be helpful.
I'll find it.
Thank you. All right. So this type of, and we've again had some discussion on this already. This type of land use can be described as being allowed by right.
C.
Yes, Johnny, it is C. And I would say that in this situation, this is not one where, oh, I need to separate, you know, what I know from where I work. No, I mean, it's saying that it's allowed by right, therefore it's permitted. You don't have to go through any additional process for a conditional use. Also, accessory or temporary uses are more of those uses that are dependent on the principal or the primary permitted use.
All right. Which of the following could be described, or which of the following could describe the term earned value? Any thoughts? This is a weird one.
B, the profit made on the project.
So that seems like a very logical answer.
I picked D, but I didn't really know and figured that was more reasonable.
So the answer is D, a method for measuring the progress of a project against the plan. But I might look to somebody else to explain it because this was a memorization one for me.
yeah, I think this is sort of a memorization one. You know, I'll be completely honest, I don't do a ton of this type of work. You know, I would say it's sort of maybe why I wouldn't pick B is because sort of like earned media, it's not something that is necessarily monetary you know, it's something that is sort of less dollar driven, I guess, if that makes sense. So it's really looking at progress, not cash. And so that's sort of how I think of why it wouldn't be B. I mean, it seems reasonable. We're talking about value, we're talking about project. I also think you could potentially eliminate A and C because it's really looking at earned value. So it's like looking backwards. So we're really looking at how much progress we've made towards what we stated we wanted to do. So it's sort of that retroactive look versus looking at how much are we going to bid this at, how much are we going to budget for, which is happening before the project starts. That would be my way of looking at this and how I would arrive at what it sounds like Johnny arrived at too. And Johnny, I don't know if you had a different way of thinking, or if it was like, yeah, this seems like what would be the most reasonable that APA would choose.
Yeah, I just exactly that. I was like, well, earned value isn't always monetary, so that's why I picked D.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Okay.
Okay. Exactions can be defined as
C.
Yep, that is correct. Johnny, what was your thought process behind that one?
Went into the legal realm of this, you know, Fifth Amendment cases, takings, exactions, that sort of thing. An exaction is usually a financial responsibility that is placed on the developer. So yeah, I don't know if that's helpful.
Awesome. No, that is very helpful. Thank you. That's a great thought process. Okay. What is the disadvantage to shift share analysis?
A.
Yep, that's correct.
This one's pretty easy, I think, because B is what it is. Or no.
That's right.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right, Johnny. The other three really are what it is and why you want to use it, right? The others are the advantages of it. So even if you know nothing about shift share analysis, which again, if you're not like working in the economic development world, or, you know, that's not your thing, like you might not know about this, but A is the only one that's sort of negative, right? When you read the responses, the others are like, oh yeah, that seems like it would be a good thing, right? They don't seem like disadvantages, right? Even if you know nothing about the topic, to me. So that's how I would approach this question.
All right. And transfer of development rights, TDRs, do which of the following?
D.
That's correct. It's all of the above.
Any questions on TDRs, PDRs, conservation easements? Those are sort of all related. You might see all of those on the test. Everybody know what a TDR is? We have some great examples locally in Colorado of folks using this. That dog has a question or thought.
Yeah, my dog is very interested in TDRs, that's for sure.
Right. Okay, so that's actually our last question. We're going to move to tips and resources, but before we do that, any like thoughts, questions, perceptions of that practice exam? Again, those aren't going to be the questions that you see necessarily. You may see very similar questions. Thoughts on other, I mean, did you guys have other questions on anything that we covered or didn't cover?
What was the percentage that you need to score to pass?
You know, there's a passing score. It's difficult to say you have to get X number of questions right, because each question is weighted differently. Nate, do you have something to add?
Yeah, that's correct. But if you do calculate it out, so the score you need, I think, is a 54. They do it on a scale of like 30 to 70. It's a totally weird scale that they determine, but I think it's around 73%, roughly. Because I remember taking it twice, doing the statistics and finding out that I was short by 2 questions and I had a 53 and it was like 72%. So very unfortunate, but then that threshold is around that. 73%.
And that's pretty common, Melissa, what Nate said. I mean, people are very, you know, it's like a bell curve, right? People are very close in their scores. I would definitely not try to play a mind game with yourself of like, I think I got this many questions, and if I don't get these, like, just do your best. You know, develop some, and we're about to talk about this, develop some like ground rules for yourself, test taking ground rules, not content specific, but pattern specific, things that have worked for you. I mean, we've all clearly at least graduated high school, I assume, probably even most of us have had some college. So we've all taken tests and challenging tests. So, you know, think about what's worked for you in the past. We can all share some tips and tricks for us. But I wouldn't get too worked up, because you will not, even though there may be some like guardrails, you will not be able to tell, like, I think this question is going to be weighted more than this. And I think, like, don't even worry about that, right? Okay, so I'm going to turn it back over to Morgan. We'll go through the tips and resources, and then we can take some more time talking about other questions.
Okay. And this, I'm not saying this because I'm the one talking, but this is my favorite part of our session, because I know that after speaking to several of you, that the hope is kind of figuring out how to study best for this. I think that going through the test is super beneficial. So thank you all for listening and working through the exam. Hopefully, if you have not worked through a practice test yet, you will start to go through more. But those who are preparing for taking their exam next month, my assumption is that this is not the first practice exam that you've gone through. So the whole purpose of the next several slides is to go over some things that holistically have helped with participants. And I'm going to throw in some things that worked for me. I'm sure that y'all saw me kind of flipping through different things. I have a gigantic bag of study materials and do reference them randomly throughout my career. There was a question that came up about hold on, I pulled the different cards. There was a question that came up earlier with the NAACP case and a similar case. I'm going to go over those types of things and my recommendations for how to study. But anyway, so with the slide that is in front of y'all, using the APA website as a resource to become comfortable with what will be on the exam, things that Erin went over at the beginning of our session today. But for those who are not taking it next month, looking at some time in the future, this is a helpful resource to see if there have been any changes in the exam. APA does regularly update how the test is formatted and what the focuses are. And that's just to kind of match up the ever-evolving industry that we're in. But we have links on the slides here and additional information. If you've got any questions, you can certainly reach out to Erin or me or Leslie. And well, Leslie's not here, but with those questions that you may have. So next slide. It's very important to format, kind of come up with a plan for yourself of how you want to study for this. It should be obvious, but it does not go without saying, because it can get easy just to kind of stick into that cycle. If you are looking at something that, oh yeah, I know this, and it makes you feel good when you get those answers right, of course, but kind of marking out where your weaknesses fall. And it's okay, all of us have weaknesses. There are things that, even though I focus on policy and I do a lot of public participation, that's where my weakness is, which was super fun to find out when I'm going through all the practice exams. The way that the questions are worded are a little tricky, and they're intended to be so. And as we've said several times this morning, of taking yourself out of that personal experience and, well, this is how I did it, or this is how my boss suggested, focusing on those different pieces that maybe you're not feeling as strong with them, and writing that into a plan if that is how you want to kind of structure your studying. Knowing your style. Personally, if I write something down, I'm more inclined to remember it. I am also more inclined to repeat something out loud, and it just sticks to memory. So knowing how UBest study. For those who maybe have not been in school for quite some time, this is super fun to remember how everything works for you. But for those who maybe recently graduated, sticking to that style or developing something new, go through the practice tests, quizzes. There are different platforms that you can find these on, which I will go over. Make flashcards that are your own, or maybe use a friend's that has already gone through the exam. And today, if anybody is interested in buddying up with someone, or anybody else, that Erin and I have received different emails from people who reach out that, hey, I would like to be able to study with someone, let us know, because we have heard from different people who may not be on the call this morning, and we can get you connected with somebody anywhere in the state, because now that we have technology, you can do that. So next slide. Going through, again, the practice test, and I'll go through where you can find those resources, because there are some that you may have to pay for and some that are free. Obviously, please do not memorize the questions, because some of them are, especially with the practice tests and quizzes, may not be something that you'll see on your exam. Maybe they were written several years ago, sometimes even decades, and the focus now should be for what's the current. An example would be if there is something that you're studying that's focused on 2000 census, please do not memorize the answer to that, because the test is most likely going to focus on 2010 census data. Read through, personalized information. Please do not make it personal. All things that we've gone through. So next slide. Okay, so study resources. There's a lot that you can find by looking at different states. Yes, National has different resources. There are some things that they are able to provide free of charge, others that you do have to pay for. But there are several states out there that have a lot of good information on their websites. Ohio has a lot of stuff that you could find just looking. Pennsylvania, Florida, Texas does have some stuff, and as a Texan, I can say that there are times where I'm a little surprised by that, but look through the different state resources. For those that are part of Colorado Springs, there are some resources that I have saved on our share drive, so y'all can look through that folder, and if you want to save anything in there. So that's kind of, I know that's a side comment specific to my coworkers, but look through what the different states have, because everybody has to take the exam. It's the same for everyone. Erin has counterparts in other states. She does communicate with them, so that if there are things that you're looking for, again, reach out and say, hey, I need maybe a little more help on XYZ, and we can try to get that information for you. So next slide.
Morgan, before we move off this, if I can just expand on that a little bit. And this is in our resource guide, which I'll put in the chat here in just a second. Some states have counterparts like me that are full-time staff, and so they have some pretty extensive prep courses. I'll highlight Florida as a really good example. I think you mentioned that, Morgan. And their PDO, at least for the, I think he's the Treasure Coast PDO, he does like I want to say an 8-week prep course. And as long as you're an APA member, did you do that one, Kate?
I didn't, but I have pointed a lot of people to Henry's resources. He is phenomenal. And he's helped a lot of people.
So they're in the middle of their workshop now. I think it's about to conclude, but they record them all. And so they do an 8-week course, and they really go through, we didn't go through a ton of content today outside of the test, but they do go through a lot of that content. And we've had some Colorado folks that have taken that. And so, we'll in the resource sheet connect you to, I think there's 6 chapters that have pretty extensive resources. And Paul, we'll make sure that you get the resource sheet, but I would say, reach out, and to Morgan's point, we're really digitally connected now. So look at some of those other state chapters and see what resources they have either online or that you can tap into, because there's some really, really extensive material out there. So thank you.
Yes. And I'm bummed that Paul's getting off, because he and I have talked about this. This is the part that I was going to call on him, but this slide doesn't look like it really has all that much information, but this is where I get really like into the nitty-gritty. So there are several sections of the exam that are going to be more of memorization. History Ethics and law are those where you can focus on maybe making a flashcard. And just as an example, so like flashcard, it's got the case, and then on the back, I have a ton of text and just highlighted what needs to be focused on. If you, like me, my degrees are not specific to planning, landscape architecture and land development. So I didn't have a class where it was focused on who are the important people for planning, what are the law cases. I knew that that was my weakness going in, and so it was a lot of memorization for me. But those are the ones that just go through and memorize. Maybe make up a song, maybe it's a little poem. There are several things that I have made ridiculous songs and I still remember them because I needed to get through the exam. With that note, please do not feel bad if you memorize it just for the exam. Most likely you're not going to have to write about Daniel or, you know, like whoever is important to the history of planning in a staff report. So just be comfortable with letting that information go after your exam. I do want to say, and Aaron mentioned there's several revisions for the Code of Ethics and which one you need to be focusing on. There was one that was recently put out. Focus on the one previous, correct, Aaron?
That's my understanding.
Yeah, okay.
Again, I don't think it's so nuanced that you're gonna like really trip yourself up.
Right. But with the Code of Ethics, this is what I made for myself. So it's literally every line in there to memorize because these will be the gimme questions. You want to have that sense of calm whenever one of those comes up that, oh, I know this, and then you can just select and move on. I did do the ethics session at the state conference recently. I have cheat sheets. I'm calling them cheat sheets. They're not cheating for any reason, but I have the older version and then a newer. If you are interested in getting that, it consolidates sections A and B of the code. So those are the aspirational and then the expectations of planners. If you want that information, I can absolutely share it with you. It just puts everything into one neat little document. So history, law, ethics. Also, someone, I think it was Paul, asked a question about demographics. Got you, Chelsea, I'll send it. This is so going on to the Census Bureau's website, there is information, and these are my actual study documents. There's information about the 2010 census and just the household makeup, population distribution. Looking through this is really beneficial because it gives you an idea of the trends, because you might have questions about that on your exam. I mentioned earlier that there are different formats, different forms of the test. So just having that holistic knowledge so that you've got the base for the different focuses of planning that Aaron went over in the beginning. And next slide.
The other thing that I'll mention just real quick, Morgan, we do have some documents that, like, for example, I created some history, people, timelines when I took the exam, and other test takers have done similar things. And we have these on our website. So
yes,
obviously, like I took the exam in 2007, so there's going to be some things missing because that was a long time ago. But the link I just put in the chat has previous test taker study materials, and some of the links we've provided you in the resource guide, which I just uploaded, but others are on here too. So again, some of these gimme questions, it's just a way to maybe help you make flashcards or do what you need to do. Thanks.
Yes. All right, so the next couple of slides are talking about where you can find these resources online, different websites that we recommend using, and different methods. So you may be familiar with the various not free sites that you can use. APA does have a prep session that you can pay for. It's several $100s if you want to do that. I did use the Planetizen study course and I passed. So, I mean, I can't say that, oh, because I used it, I passed, but I will say that that's the resource that I utilized. It's also several $100s. With this, I would say it's very much a personal decision on your end of if you want to do it. I mentioned at the beginning of this session that I do have test anxiety. If you give me an essay or I need to do a presentation, golden, but something where I have to go through and select A, B, C, or D, the best answer I don't do so well with that. And knowing myself well enough, which is something that's very important for you all, how to study and what do you need to focus your time and potentially financial resources on. So those two are examples of a few that are out there that you do have to pay for. Planning Prep is an example of a website that has free tests that you can use. And I did look through it kind of recently. Several of the exams that are on there are still pretty dated. They're more focused on information that's from like the 2000 census, for example, but it's still very beneficial to go through that because it gets your brain thinking of the types of questions that will come up. And if there is something that is, and I'm just going to use the census one because it's easy, there's a number tied to it. If you're getting questions of the 2000 census had this information, you know that that's probably not going to show up. So taking that information and looking up what is more current is really helpful as a tactic. When I was doing a lot of the different practice exams, I got several questions about demographics of Native populations. I didn't end up getting any questions on my actual exam, but I kept getting them. So I just went and researched that information so that I felt comfortable just in case. There's also an app that you can download, Quizlet, and there are several of others that are comparable. This is you, so I want to do like big star and highlight. If you're using those types of apps, please be mindful that it is, anybody can put that information up. So it may be something that you're having to sort through, and also I should say that the app is basically like flashcards on your phone. So anybody can upload, and you'll have to go through different exams that people may be taking, like the nursing exam, bar. There's lots of just random exams out there. So you'll have to refine it to look for AICP. But that is something that I used when I'm just sitting around somewhere, or maybe in the car for a long time before I start to feel a little nauseous. But using those resources when you're kind of in that downtime, so your brain is still going through and you're keeping up with your studying. So that's something that I do recommend. I'm just making sure. Another thing. So I'll show this to y'all. Again, I benefit by having actual paper. So this is also on the APA website. All of these tabs are the different PAS reports. You can print them off and read through them, like I painstakingly did, and then realized this is kind of silly. Please go through those, because that is information on various topics, more of a honed in informational document that APA puts out. And you can read through, what does APA say about freight and the trucking industry? So it's very specific topics, but it may be beneficial for you all to go through them. Again, if it's something that you're not super familiar with. So next slide. YouTube has a lot of resources. So just search for AICP and you can find some of those practice sessions similar to ours. Maybe it's from a different state and they've gone through a study session. You can watch theirs. They could have very different approaches, different information that could be beneficial to you. There are also some professors that have uploaded various videos. So watch through them if you want to. They are hours long, but it could be very beneficial for you to go through them. I've just been writing different notes throughout. I don't really have anything else. Okay, so the next slide. These are just some quotes from people who have in our state what has helped them. So find a study buddy. Whenever I was preparing for the exam, I studied with someone who had unfortunately not passed several times. And I do not want that to be something that is a fear that you kind of put in your head that I'm not going to pass, or I shouldn't study with someone who hasn't passed. You should see that as a huge benefit, because they already know what the questions, kind of how it's formatted. The person I studied with, poor thing, ended up getting all 3 different versions of the exam. She did pass the 3rd time, but that's a huge benefit to study with someone who's already gone through the test, because they will have some tips that are very beneficial for you. But again, if you do want to get paired up with someone who's not on this call this morning, let us know and we can get you connected. So next slide. So with this, I will say that whenever I took the exam, I had been a planner for some time already. Mentioned that I don't love tests, so I intentionally put it off. I didn't want to do it because I was scared that, you know, I didn't want to pursue it. Studying helped me, I feel like made me a better planner after I took the exam. Aaron mentioned at the beginning of our session today that having the letters behind your name, it's like you're automatically holding yourself to a higher standard, but you're part of this group of other amazing planners who've gone through the same thing. And it's something that you can use to just further refine yourself and make you a better planner overall. There are several other reasons for getting AICP, but that's just something with what this person mentioned from their experience. And next slide. So yes, this one is my favorite. Memorization blows. Having to go through and memorize all of this stuff because there's only so much we can hold in our brain. But again, go through those things, get comfortable with it. You take the exam and then you can just, you know, like Harry Potter style, just pull it out of your brain and throw it out. But this is truly what will help you be successful for those focuses where you're able to memorize the history, law, and ethics, go through it, memorize, brush up on it, but still focus on the things that you're not as strong in. If memorization is one of your strong points, if it's not, then focus on memorizing. Again, make up a little song, a poem, whatever works for you. And as Aaron mentioned, we do have a list of resources that we will share with y'all. You might have put that in the chat. I saw some things that were popping up, but I was not reading. My biggest piece of advice for y'all whenever you're taking the exam, please just let yourself relax. When you're in that room, it's going to be, well, for me, it was a little scary, but then once I started getting into the test, I weirdly just immediately calmed down. As you go through it, you can mark those questions that you're not totally sure about and go back. Again, I'm speaking from my experience. I marked half of the questions. I got up, made myself walk around, use the bathroom, kind of breathe, came back, and I changed half of my answers. I did pass, so that was clearly a good decision on my part. But if there is something that you're getting stuck on, make a little note, because there are questions that will be associated with others, and you may be able to use different questions to help you answer others that you're a little stuck on. That's all that I have, I think. Aaron and Kate might say something that reminds me of something that I forgot, but that's my focus here, friends. We truly are here to help you. So if you've got any questions, want to know what resources that we have, let us know, and we're happy to send you any of that information. Oh yeah, and here are our email addresses so that you can reach out to us. But Aaron, Kate, anything that I forgot?
I would just say don't leave questions blank.
Oh yeah.
You know, I think it's a really good point that you make, and we saw that even during the practice exam. Other test questions can help you answer questions. So if you're not sure, I mean, my strategy with test taking is to not change my answer, but I'd say find out what works for you. So maybe you know, for me, if I didn't know right away, I would mark it and come back to it. Maybe you mark what your gut feeling is, and then you come back and revisit that, but definitely don't leave any questions blank. You know, one strategy, I've heard that people are successful, go through and answer everything that's really easy for you, and then come back through and tackle the hard ones. So as you're going through the practice exams, think about like what strategy feels most comfortable for you and do that. We do have a couple people, and I think we have one person's contact info up online right now that's forming a study group. For me, that was super successful. I've had a study group of 3. One of us did not pass. The other thing I would say, and I always tell everyone this, is if you don't pass the first time, the second time, even the third time, it doesn't mean you're a bad planner.
Right.
It's great to have your AICP, and we are definitely here to help you all succeed, and you all can succeed. But if you don't pass your first time or even afterwards, I know lots of people that aren't AICP that are amazing planners. So part of it is test taking, right? And that's, and really part of that is figuring out what works for you. You know, Nate, I know you took the exam twice. You're a super competent individual. I don't think that reflects on you, but it can be done, right? It can be passed even if you've done it multiple times. So here's all of our contact information. I left Leslie up here. She's, as Morgan mentioned early on, the North Central area rep. So she's on the board with us as well and really involved in the PDC. She just had a personal commitment. She's really great she's been in the profession a long time. She's got private sector and public sector experience and is got a lot of subject matter expertise. So none of us, oddly, this is like the first time ever that we haven't had a transportation expert in our in our workspace. So normally there's lots of transportation people, but I know lots of transportation planners, as do my colleagues. So if none of you are transportation planners, if that's something you need to be connected with, like you want to talk through LOS or volume to capacity, like we'll get you hooked up with people. The board is really willing to help. So let us know. And like I said, we have very specific questions that are asked to us. So don't feel like I should know this, I don't want to ask. We're here to help. So here's all of our contact info. I did record this and we'll post it online. So if you want to come back to something, my parting advice would be take as many practice exams as you can, not to Morgan's point, not to memorize the questions, but just to hopefully reduce some of your anxiety about how to answer the questions. Because, obviously you've all gotten to the point of getting here. You can absolutely pass this test, and let us know what additional resources you need. If you are comfortable with me sending out your contact information, there's a handful of folks that are here today, certainly the staff in Colorado Springs. You guys, it's great that so many of you are taking the exam and have these amazing resources in-house, but even for those of you who aren't in Colorado Springs, there's others taking the test. We're happy to connect you. If you don't want your email shared, and I'm not sure that I have everyone's email because I'm not sure everyone registered through the website, just shoot me a quick note. You can message me individually and say, like, please don't share my email. Or if you are comfortable, why don't you drop in your email into the chat, and then I'll send out a clean copy of the practice exam and answer guide. And then I can send out this presentation as well and our resource guide with the participants for today, so you can connect and maybe form a virtual study group, trade flashcards. That's a really cool, way to partner with people, meet up, for coffee or drinks or whatever you want, talk planning.
Yeah, and Erin, just before we end today, I just wanted to say or share one of the strategies that really helped me as far as taking the exam goes. And that is when you have multiple choice questions, one strategy that I do is I read the answers before I read the question. And what that helps me do is by reading the answers first, is that as you then go through and read the question and what the formulation of the question is, it may help focus you or identify the answer more quickly as like a time-saving strategy so that you can go forward and answer the rest of them. I also have like very significant test anxiety. So that was something that really, really assisted me in helping me feel comfortable that I was getting the right information out of the prompt when I was attempting to answer a question. And then, as you mentioned before, just flagging questions or noting questions that may be more difficult for you, and not spending a lot of time and like really killing your brain to answer that question as it comes up. You can always go back to it. And so again, for time saving purposes, to identify, if it takes you more than 30 seconds to answer the question, flag it and move on. If that works for you. That was a strategy that worked really well for me, so that I didn't have to constantly jump back and forth between questions. And I definitely used all 3.5 hours of the exam when I took it to ensure that I really answered all of the questions and felt comfortable with the responses that I had given. So those are two things that really helped for me. I took the exam in 2017, so the test has changed a lot since I took it. But I think the more key strategic pieces to answering questions can be really helpful in feeling confident and comfortable in the exam setting.
Perfect. Thank you, Kate. Nate, any words of wisdom for you? I mean, obviously you've shared a bit today, but anything that's different from what the three of us had in terms of strategy?
Yeah, a lot of similarities from what you've said. Personally, I think there's huge benefit. You really do want to take practice exams, like find a method or a way, whether it's through planning prep. One technique, and I'll admit this kind of is a way to like get around, is if you're in a group. We know that the Plan Edison courses are expensive, but you guys can technically split the cost of the registration and use the program kind of intermittently, which gives everyone an opportunity to, take an exam. Those exams also have explanations for the rationale behind the answers. And that's really helpful. Like not just being like, I don't understand why, sometimes we're like, that makes no sense. The best key especially with the way the Plan Edison does it, is they give you their response and kind of give you in-depth answers as to why APA thinks of it this way or why they responded this way, so that you can go back and be like, okay, now I know how they're thinking about it. If I see a similar question, I can totally answer it, based on their methodologies. And then, I spent as much time as close to 100 hours personally. It's everyone's preference on how they want to study. But, for those taking it in November, you really only have another 6 weeks, it seems like, depending on your window. But, do try and put in as much kind of time. At least that was my method, putting in frequent amount of studying and dedicate that like at the end of the day, especially if you're tired after work, you still have to maybe split it up and do like an hour and a half on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and not cram it all into the weekends, because you guys want to enjoy your weekends. And I'm sure that's a big part of it too. So that's my advice there.
I think that's actually a great place to end. I agree. Study as much as you can, but also don't psych yourself out and overstudy, right? Like still enjoy your life, still enjoy your weekend. So with that, we will see if there's any other questions. And if not, we will, I have some goings on upstairs, so I'm sorry about all the noise. We'll give you back 20 minutes of your Saturday. You can either study or you can, go enjoy a cup of coffee and maybe a walk out in the beautiful fall weather. So any last minute questions, thoughts?
This was really helpful. So thank you guys. The one question I was just going to ask, I heard little snippets of it kind of throughout, but can you talk a little bit more about what the actual test format looks like? I heard you say, Kate, it's 3.5 hours, but like how many questions? Is it all digital? Can you take breaks at any time? Stuff like that.
So it is digital. You will be taking it at a testing center. And I think they're sort of back to I know it was different during the pandemic. For those of you who may have taken it during the pandemic, but you'll sign up at a testing center. You'll arrive at the testing center. There may be slight nuanced rules at the testing center that you're at, but generally you can't take in materials with you. I don't think you can take in your phone. I don't know if I even had a cell phone when I took the test, if it's been that long. But, usually you can take in pen and paper, pencil and paper, maybe a calculator. They did allow me to take a calculator. Do they not even?
I couldn't, but
I could not, no.
A while ago.
So no calculators. Let's take that off the table. Thanks, Johnny. Have a great weekend. The test will be digital on the computer. Again, you can make notes. There's a way to mark things kind of in the application and revisit. You'll have 3.5 hours to complete the test. There'll be a half-hour tutorial to help you orient you to how to do it, how to mark things, how to come back to things. So it'll give you that orientation. And then there's 20 practice questions, 150 graded questions. Historically, you would get sort of an unofficial result at the end, but I don't think they're back to that quite yet. So once you complete the test, you'll submit it, and then your official results will be mailed to you. So everything will be on the computer. Yes, you can take bathroom breaks. There's a protocol within each testing center for how you need to notify them of that. Typically you have kind of imagine like in college, the library, like desks you had, that's how my testing center was, where it's private-ish, right? And quiet. I don't know if you have headphones. That's one thing I don't remember. I don't recall that. But
when I took mine, we were not permitted headphones, and they weren't part of it at all. So it was just sort of the background noise of the testing center.
Which is pretty quiet, right? That was my experience.
It was quiet, but there's definitely still noise. I have a tendency to get really distracted by things that I can't see. And one of the prompts that Prometric gives you, which I believe is still the exam administrated, they give you the prompt that you shouldn't be looking around. You need to keep your eyes forward and all these different things. So for me, hearing noise behind me, my initial reaction is I want to look around, and that's not something that you're technically permitted to do in the exam space.
Yeah, and the Mel, I know you had a question. The practice questions are integrated, so you won't know which are practice questions. Answer every question as if it's a real question. I mean, it is a real question, as if it's a scored question.
Yeah. And one other piece of advice for testing centers, particularly now that it's moved back to the pre-pandemic in-person at a testing center. Sometimes testing centers can be tucked into office buildings or other places. And I'm not sure that we all go to testing centers all that often. When I took the exam, I lived on the East Coast. I lived in Philadelphia, and I had never been there before. So I went to it the day before, and I had gotten a hotel kind of adjacent to the testing center, but I had made it a point to go the day before and dry run. How long will it take me to park my car and get there and do all the things and get upstairs and get through security, so that I knew how much time I needed to give myself to feel comfortable in advance of the exam. So if you've not been to the testing center before, directions are great, but if you have the opportunity to kind of dry run it in person, so you know how much time to give yourself, could also be helpful in feeling comfortable.
I'll add one very quick thing too. Eat healthy and exercise. Feel good for the exam. Don't wake up with, having not drinking anything. I think the second time I took it, I attribute my success to the second time because I did specific things that made me feel like I was ready for the exam. I was in the right headspace at that point. So, make sure you have whatever your specific diet is, or if you do need to exercise, do it the night before or, that morning of, to get you in the right space.
Super great suggestions, you guys. Thank you. Sometimes those are some of the things we don't think about, right? So here's our contact info. Please contact us. We look forward to celebrating with you all, either next spring if you take the exam in the fall, or next, at the state conference potentially, or whenever you pass the exam. So best of luck to you all. I'm sure you're going to do great, and we are here if you have questions. And thank you, PDC members, board members, for helping on this Saturday. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Okay, take care, everyone.
Thank you,
Bye,
everyone.
Bye all.